Hey folks, welcome back. Please bear with me as I try to explain what's going on here. There are organizations that are paid money by the federal government to provide refugee services. Some of them do a good job, some of them do an abysmal job. Now, I've not waded into this situation in Florida, but it is time to do so and raise some pertinent questions about what's happening. Gulf Coast Jewish Family and Community Services partners with HIAS, a prominent international nonprofit and federal resettlement contractor, to provide refugee resettlement and support services. Now, under this partnership, according to their own information, Gulf Coast JFCS serves as an official affiliate subcontractor that works under HIAS. In this capacity, Gulf Coast JFCS operates as the local agency implementing HIAS's refugee and special immigrant visa welcoming programs across the Florida Gulf Coast. Okay, so we're talking about HIAS and JFCS, all right? One at national, one local level. Now, how do they do that? Well, according to the JFCS website, the two organizations jointly facilitate programs like refugee resettlement, helping individuals find housing, food, and employment, and helping refugee career pathways, mentoring refugees to help them adapt their professional skills to the American workforce. So who exactly is HIAS that partners with the JFCS? Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. They receive tens of millions of dollars in federal funding annually, with the government grants typically making up between 40 and 50% of their yearly revenue. Now, their primary funding source is the Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, PRM, and the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, according to the 2023 tax return, which is a matter of public record, and it's posted on their own website, HIAS is the international Jewish nonprofit that stands for a world in which refugees find welcome, safety, and opportunity. Well, that sounds lovely. Brilliant. In 2023, they reported $136,348,669 in contributions and grants. The then Chief Executive Officer, Mark Hetfield, received $396,242 in direct compensation and a further $21,621 in other compensation. The top 10 officers of this nonprofit received direct compensation of $2.4 million in the 2023 tax year. Well, now that we know a little bit about HIAS and its funding, let's take a look at its recent media release on the 19th of May, 2026 from Silver Spring, Maryland. Ostensibly, that's where they're based at. HIAS strongly condemns the Trump administration's reported decision to increase the refugee admission ceiling mid-year in order to admit an additional 10,000 white South Africans, while tens of thousands of refugees fleeing war, persecution, and violence remain stranded and blocked from protection and have remained that way since January 20th, 2025. The continued use of prioritization of white South Africans negates and demonizes the lived experiences of millions of refugees around the world. Well, first off, that's a passel of lies. A passel of lies. Nobody has to accept any refugee into this country. There is no country that borders us where people are fleeing from with legitimate basis. None. Not from Canada, not from Mexico. And these people can seek refugee status elsewhere. The United States is not the only country that can take refugees. So that's a passel of lies. But let me break this down. First off, it is not white South Africans. And even if it was, so what? Does that mean HIAS is racist against whites? Did they have the same complaints about 300,000 white, Christian, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Ukrainians flooding into this country in a 3-year period? I don't recall them objecting to that. Second, the exclusion of minority South Africans in favor of Afghans and Ukrainians, among others, for years negated the lived misery and persecution and neglected South Africans for years. So their silly argument carries no weight with those who are well-informed. And third, HIAS strongly condemns the Trump administration's reported decision to increase the refugee admission ceiling mid-year in order to admit an additional 10,000 refugees. Sorry, isn't that your purpose, is to help refugees, and you have an objection to the Trump administration bringing in 10,000 additional refugees? What is your purpose here? Now, they say their mission is the following: drawing on our Jewish values and history and working with host communities, HIAS provides vital services to refugees, asylum seekers, and others forcibly displaced and stateless persons around the world, and advocates for their fundamental rights so they can rebuild their lives. Well, that sure sounds good. But it doesn't sound like they're helping people from around the world. it sounds a lot more like racism or bigotry directed against South Africans by an uninformed political actor playing and helping others. On the HIAS website, there's a Take Action page, and there they have a pledge. They ask folks to sign the pledge. Sign the pledge. I stand with refugees. The U.S. government has abandoned refugees and immigrants, but HIAS never will. As we move into the second year of the Trump administration, the challenges will persist, but we will too, fighting the same fight we've championed for more than a century. Will you add your name to the pledge, reaffirming your commitment to protecting all who seek safety? The only problem with this, it seems that HIAS does not live up to their own pledge. Based on claims from South Africans and in their own email messages to those South African refugees, HIAS is abandoning refugees in need, and they seek your donations to do so. Case in point, this message from the JFCS, a partner of HIAS. Dear all, we hope you're doing well. We regret to inform you that Gulf Coast JFCS PC GAPS program is unable to cover rent payments for the month of June. We understand how important this financial help is, but we received new guidance from HIAS on Wednesday, the 13th of May, 2026. Now, that's significant for two reasons. Number one, this message didn't come out until the 19th, a full week after they were notified. People in desperate situations who are refugees who have no money to pay for rent are being abandoned by the Gulf Coast JFCS as per direction from the national organization that is attacking the Trump administration and claims that they will never abandon refugees. But in fact, that's exactly what they're doing. They made a decision on the 13th of May not to fund rent for refugees who've been here less than 3 months. Why? Why is this the case? And why did it take a week to inform them? That's a week that South Africans could have begged for money or called home or asked for someone to help them. They were expecting rent to be paid, but suddenly out of the blue, a week after being notified, this agency tells them they get no rent money. Now, how is that possible? How is that possible? What is going on at HIAS, this Hebrew organization? You would think that an organization dedicated to helping Jews would be sensitive to bigotry and racism, but apparently they're not. In fact, they're uninformed and therefore express their bigotry directed against South Africans. But I didn't hear that coming from them when 300,000 Ukrainians came here. So this is a personal email in response to that from one of the refugees directly affected by it. I will not read all the message. To the folks at Gulf Coast JFCS. I find it unacceptable that you were notified of HIAS' decision on May 13th, but only informed me on May 19th, 5 days later. While having no issue processing another payment for me on May 18th, informing me with such short notice that rent will not be covered while I'm still well within the first 90 days in the United States represents a serious failure in your responsibilities as my resettlement agency. And I agree. I would also argue that I believe it's intentional. The intent here is for South Africans to fail, because there's no excuse for waiting a week. This should be a crisis moment. The moment that this sub-organization finds out that it's not getting funding from its parent organization to take care of rent for these refugees who they're responsible for, they should have been on the phone to these refugees immediately. Regarding the matching grant program, Gulf Coast JFCS participates in and runs the OR-funded Refugee Employment Match Grant Program in Pinellas County. You told me from the first day I arrived that you don't do this program. However, this is not only listed on your website, it is an Office of Refugee Resettlement funded program that must begin within the first month of arrival and can provide support for up to 180 days. Why was I never assessed for eligibility or offered enrollment in matching grant, especially given that it is designed exactly for cases like mine? So why did the Gulf Coast JFCS neglect to do the matching grant? The same situation we saw with Church World Service in Rochester, New York, and we've seen elsewhere from other agencies intentionally preventing refugees from getting resources that are allocated to them under the law. Someone needs to be held to account for this. Now, this refugee asked for responses. According to HIAS's Refugee Resettlement Core Services document, the RMP program provides dedicated caseworker support for 90 days from arrival. Why have I not received this required support or even a dedicated caseworker? Fair question. Despite repeated requests since my arrival, I've not received a bus pass or transportation training. Now, why would that be necessary? People coming from Afghanistan who don't have access to public transportation here or other countries don't know how it works. Therefore, you're supposed to get training. South Africans are no different. They're entitled to this training. And that agency gets paid to provide that service, which they're clearly not providing. I've applied or been applied for DCF 3 times, and each application failed due to lack of follow-up and support from Gulf Coast JFCS. Now, I can't verify what that situation is, but that sounds rather disturbing. So, ladies and gentlemen, what exactly is the role of Hebrew immigration? What is the role of the Gulf Coast JFCS? They claim they're here to support and help refugees, but that does not appear to be the case in Florida, in Tampa, Florida. I have met these refugees. I have been there. I have seen this. And there's a serious problem here. The Office of Refugee Resettlement needs to take a look at this. Now, I am reticent to talk about these agencies, but everything I've told you, aside from the emails that they've shared publicly, all the information I got to you came from public sources. Nothing being doxed here, simply stating the facts. Stating the facts. Something that the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society doesn't do. Lying about who's coming here in their press statement on the 19th of May. And then claiming that they help refugees and they'll never abandon any refugee. Well, that's a lie. They are clearly abandoning South Africans, and it would appear to be intentional. Why? Why are they doing this? It doesn't make any sense unless it is intentional, and the idea is to help South Africans fail. What say you, South Africa? What say you, America? Our tax dollars fund this organization, according to its own records, 40 to 50% of their annual budget. They get like $200 million a year. Their CEO makes $400,000 a year roughly. And they're going to turf out refugees who they haven't provided the most basic of resources for. They're not communicating with these refugees. At least this case officer isn't. And it's clear that the parent organization has some sort of intentional effort to undermine support for these refugees. ORR needs to get involved. What say you?